What is up, everyone? Happy Martin Luther King Day. Today we're doing something that might or might not be blasphemous on Martin Luther King Day, but we are going to be reviewing Malcolm X's autobiography. But Greg, why aren't you reviewing Martin Luther King? Well, I reviewed his Chaos and Community last year, so you can listen to that. I had a pretty bad microphone, so I'm sorry if you do listen to that, but it exists. That review exists. This year, we're talking about Malcolm. And honestly, I didn't know a whole lot about Malcolm prior to reading this. So a lot of this was new for me, and it made it a very interesting experience for me. I'm just going to contrast my views on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So Martin Luther King, I feel like I had a notion in my head of him being a civil rights leader, which of course he was, but he was also like a workers' rights leader, an anti-war leader. You know, he had things like the Poor People's Campaign, and he was just an all-around activist for everyone who was struggling. There's definitely a difference in how I used to think about Martin Luther King before learning about his life and what I think about him after reading about him. And similar to Malcolm X too, after reading more about his life. MLK, I feel like people are told lies by omission with him. People know about the bus boycotts. They know about Selma, Alabama, and civil rights and voting rights. But they don't know about worker rights, and they don't know about his Poor People's Campaign and just advocating for the poor and the workers. Now, Malcolm's a bit different of a story. Instead of lies by omission, there are lies by commission. Malcolm would oftentimes get accused of being a violent or militant black supremacist, like an extremist. And there are definitely a lot of things about Malcolm that made him unusual. Being, Nation of Islam, was very unusual in the United States. And to the extent that became less unusual, a lot of that is due to Malcolm himself and just how charismatic of a speaker he was and how good he was at connecting things like spiritual beliefs to things like human rights and dignity for African Americans. Now, this book's obviously an autobiography as well, so there's a lot of narrative about his life. And, this is a very real and heavy book. I'm just gonna read the first paragraph on the first page. When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. And it goes on to explain just those terroristic acts, both before Malcolm was born, throughout his childhood growing up. And it really doesn't pull any punches. So, of course, if that bothers you, you don't have to read this book, but, I think it's historically important and very interesting and definitely an engaging life story to just dive right into. And it's interesting, the first 174 pages of this book are basically life story stuff, not really political, because he wasn't really political growing up. I mean, to the extent that a black man in the United States of America cannot be political from the 30s to the 40s, this was apolitical. And this first part is kind of about his hustling life, how he made money after dropping out of school after the 8th grade. And, he was caught up in things like the drug market, the prostitution market. I think he name-dropped every black musician to play in Harlem or Roxbury in Boston from 1940 to 1950. But his hustling days catch up with him. He goes into jail or prison for 10 years, I think. His life changes. He starts to read more. And this is on a personal level where I was like, oh yeah, this guy's awesome. It would be lights out at 10 in the prison, but he would have books in his cell and he would have just enough light to read. And he said he would read until 3 or 4 in the morning. And every time a guard came around, every hour, he would pretend to be asleep because you had to be asleep. And yeah, he started learning a lot. Once he learned, more English and dictionary stuff and better penmanship. The first thing he learned was history, and more specifically, the history of the white man, as he says. and the atrocities of the white man. I know I'm going to get comments about me saying the white man as a white person. It's okay. We're going to try to represent what Malcolm is saying here, okay? So yeah, once Malcolm starts learning a bit more about history, he learns about the Nation of Islam. It was headed by a minister named Elijah Muhammad, and he was said to be the messenger to Allah, which is God. And Malcolm writes Elijah Muhammad every day from prison, and then when he gets out, he goes to meet him, and Malcolm's family is all already converted to the Nation of Islam. And the next long while in the book, in fact, the most of the rest of Malcolm's life, he's with the Nation of Islam, and he becomes Minister Malcolm X. And the X in his name represents the name that was stolen by the white man when Afro-Americans were taken into slavery. Now look, whenever I talk about Nation of Islam, I can't not bring up the Nation of Islam today and the leader Louis Farrakhan, who is deeply anti-Semitic, or at least his comments indicate that. And look, it's a problem that we won't dive deep into, but basically Nation of Islam now, not ideal, not good. But back in Malcolm's time, Nation of Islam was seen as obviously extreme because, Muslims today are considered very uncommon, at least, if nothing else, here in the United States. But they also preached a sort of black empowerment, and they preached about the atrocities of both across the globe, but very centrally in the United States, because obviously they're a group in the United States, so they cater to their audience. Now, oh man, I don't even know what to say about this time in Malcolm's life, but basically he was everywhere. He was very, I don't want to say explicitly politically active because he wasn't involved in like Beltway politics, but he was involved in like the main issue of the time, which was civil rights. But he didn't frame it as civil rights. He framed it as human rights. And he didn't even really talk about civil rights. He like almost mocked, civil rights. Like, what? Come on, man. What are you, these civil rights, when we don't have human rights as black people? Malcolm would definitely strongly be very critical of these black groups that got funded by white people, basically, and got their message tailored very specifically to fit into the white people political system and, media, cultural systems. And, this would include someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who was extremely strategic. And, while MLK was very uncompromising in his beliefs, or he would try to tailor the speech to the widest audience possible, and he would try to, play ball with politicians when possible. And he would get the huge movement on his side, which was extremely important. And, all these marches wouldn't have worked if he didn't have all these people. But Malcolm was critical because, these marches he would get clearance for, and he would do everything right, which sounds like kind of a weird thing to be critical for. But, he was kind of just criticizing the results, if nothing else. After MLK's March on Washington, not one senator or representative changed their mind on voting rights or civil rights. Now, I'm not saying don't do the march or whatever, but Malcolm demanded more, and the Nation of Islam demanded more. Specifically, one of the things the Nation of Islam wanted was its own plot of land that could just be for only black people, basically. Now, look, of course that's not going to happen. There's no plots of land open, and they aren't going to be able to kick everyone off their land. And by they, I mean I could mean anyone. No one can kick everyone off. You can't just evacuate Florida or something and just say, okay, here's your Nation of Islam state. It just wouldn't work. But for Malcolm, I think it was more of the idea and the teachings of the Nation of Islam. And it was kind of preaching this sort of idea that as black people, we all have humanity with each other. And I mean, not myself, but Malcolm and all the black people he was preaching to. And his idea was you first need solidarity with and among black people before you can have black-white solidarity. At least that was in part the idea. And there was a community aspect to it. Like, think about it. If someone in your church group or something is targeted by some sort of police brutality. I know, like, this is ancient history. Of course, nothing like this would happen today. But if something like that were to happen at the time, if there's like a group in place to have your back and to go out and protest, and back then it was more riot than it is now, that would be amazing. And back then, there were a ton of race riots. And, Malcolm wouldn't vocally support or oppose the riots or like the damage done and like the violence and stuff. But what he would advocate for was to fix the underlying problem. And to him, that problem was black people not being treated as human. Now, later in the book, Malcolm has a falling out with the Nation of Islam. And he said the chickens are coming home to roost in response to the JFK assassination. And that was part of a much longer quote that goes into way more detail about why the assassination happened and blah, blah, blah. But the Nation of Islam did not want anyone taking any sort of stand on the political assassination. No comments. But Malcolm did comment, so he was censored for 90 days. But the Nation of Islam leadership wanted him out anyway, so they were like, okay, we're going to use this as a pretext to basically cut ties with him. And then Malcolm X saw, like, oh, this is what's happening here. So he went to go hide with a boxer who would later be called Muhammad Ali. And Muhammad Ali, of course, joined the Nation of Islam. And though Malcolm had still cut ties with the Nation of Islam, he was still influential. He still spoke at colleges and stuff. And this is when he really started fearing for his life. He basically thought that the Nation of Islam would assassinate him, for lack of a better term, which they did. So at this point, Malcolm goes overseas to Mecca, which is like the capital, which is in Saudi Arabia, and it's kind of like the Muslim capital of the world, if you will. And he met the religious leaders there and the future king of Saudi Arabia he met there. And what he was interested in was all the people there. There were people of different shades and different colors. There was white people, brown people, black people. They were all there, and they like almost didn't see race. It was in a lot of ways post-racial, and they were very spiritual because they were obviously all there to support the one and only God, Allah. And there was a sort of brotherly feel between everyone and a sort of camaraderie that crossed over racial lines. And it was here where Malcolm had a more nuanced view on the white man, or at least he developed a more nuanced view on the white man. Prior to this, it was like, the white man is the devil, and that's kind of like what the Nation of Islam believed. But here he saw kind of a more post-racial world. So he began to see people as people, sort of more so. He was still extremely distrusting of white people in the United States, but it changed because he recognized that it was United States culture that made people think in the context of racial superiority and stuff. It wasn't that white people are like inherently devils or evil or anything. He kept traveling. So he first went to the Arabian Peninsula, which I just talked about, in Mecca, and then he traveled through Africa and started learning about things like the Angolan Revolution against the French, and revolutions against like the Portuguese and the British and stuff throughout Africa, and freedom movements and, African solidarity. And he mentioned Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And he started to think more globally and more in terms of like international solidarity. And he realized things like, Angola's fight against France, that might not be the best person to fight or best country to fight against on the international stage. If they fight against like the United States, for instance, the United States has much more power on the national stage, and the United States can kind of like force France to, cut ties with its colonies. And after his trip, or during his trip, I guess, he said, the first thing the American power structure doesn't want any Negroes to start is thinking internationally. And in his travels in Ghana, there was one part that it was like a little bit funny for me, but it established him as like, a great almost travel blogger, to the extent that like blogs existed in the 60s. He would have been phenomenal at blogging. He would go from like talking about his trip in Ghana, and then he would overhear white foreigners talking about the mineral wealth in Ghana and trying to take that over and, sell the minerals and natural resources to other countries and take all the profits out of the country that they're taking the resources from, and just take all the profits. So it goes from like African travel blog to atrocities of the white man, both historical and current atrocities, and then like into like spiritual Islam and like camaraderie around being Islam, and then back into travel blog. It's just like so seamless, and this is all like within like half of a page. He could be like very succinct and very punchy. Like if you ever hear like a good debater, they've always got like a good like one-liner, and Malcolm was a phenomenal debater. If you watch like, TV interviews from the 60s where, people are like throwing out all this nonsense about him, it's like, and it's like, you guys know the playbook. Even if you don't know anything about Malcolm X, you know this playbook where it's like, there was a race riot and some property damage and 2 innocent white people died. Do you condemn that? But the thing about Malcolm is he didn't think in terms of like strategy. He thought on, again, very human perspective. And it's like, well, what caused that riot? Maybe if white people treated black people with humanity, there wouldn't be riots. Or at least there wouldn't be racial riots. I'm sure there would still be riots if, the Dodgers win the World Series or whatever. But oh yeah, back to Ghana. Man, I'm all over the place in this video. So white people taking minerals from Africa, standard white people colonialist stuff. So Malcolm was giving a speech to an audience there with some of those white people and, African leaders and presidents and stuff. And Malcolm was basically like, you white people here, you don't care about the people here. What you do like is the minerals Africa has under her soil. I'm not anti-American, and I don't come here to condemn America. I come here to tell the truth, and if the truth condemns America, then she stands condemned. And these white business people knew how bad that looked for them. And Malcolm continued. And yeah, man, that's a pretty good note to end it on. I know Malcolm X's daughter came out with a book like a year ago. I literally don't know anything about it. So yeah. As far as his view on women, yes, we can do better. I think if Malcolm lived in this time, I hope he would be, better. Jeez, I don't know. Like, anytime you're like in like this sort of like very religious mindset in the, 50s and 60s, again, nothing wrong with religion, cool. I'm not personally religious, but if you are religious, great. But 50s and 60s religion had very, regressive, I guess, gender roles, which I just don't agree with. And I am happy that religion in a lot of places has progressed forward. And in this country more broadly, gender roles have been opened up both ways, in fact. But yeah, this has been my nonfiction book of the month pick for January. Next month, Naomi Klein, who is like a renowned feminist. We're reading Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. So hopefully that like balances out anyone who's reading along and maybe had issues with Malcolm's like kind of general views on women. Again, this book's not like about his views on women. If it were, it would probably be something a lot of people wouldn't read. But because Malcolm like definitely really centralizes race and like ignores a lot of other things like gender things, he was pro-gun laws, and he talks positively about like universal health care, which is great, but again, it's not like his central thing. This is definitely like a very historically important book, and it definitely like racial history important, and racially historically and racially significant right now in this time. Malcolm distilled the LBJ versus Barry Goldwater presidential race as Johnson is the fox and Goldwater is the wolf. And here was his distillation of conservatism versus liberalism. And again, think about if this is relevant today. Maybe to a lesser extent today, but think about if it's relevant, okay? Quote, conservatism in Americans' politics means let's keep the N-words in their place. And liberalism means let's keep the Negroes in their place, but tell them we'll treat them a little bit better. Let's fool them with more promises. I mean, to me, it seems like that's where we're at today in a lot of ways. I mean, the language is different. No one says any word beginning with the letter N in regards to race anymore. But besides that, yes, this is unfortunately where we are, at least in terms of, politics, like political leaders and stuff. And, I know some people out there are like, well, like Democrats are like kind of cool sometimes. And I don't make me play the clip of Nancy Pelosi not supporting Black Lives Matter in 2019. Don't make me do that again, guys. I don't want to do that. Don't make me put up like the RBG quotes of her not supporting Kaepernick. I don't want to do this to like nominally okay people. All right. Anyway, I love you all. I love Malcolm. There's things I disagree with about Malcolm. I think if I were alive in, 64 or whatever, I would have voted for LBJ over Goldwater because Goldwater was like openly freaking racist. So and LBJ was also racist, but not openly. So I guess I'm a lesser of two evils voter. And man, this video's gone off on so many side tangents. And I feel like, this is very difficult to talk about this book just because there's so much in it. And I do want to listen more and learn more from everyone. So just comment below. I know I'm a white person talking about race, so I don't know. Hopefully it's not cringe. And hopefully I represented Malcolm's views well. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Happy Martin Luther King Day. And again, Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine. Next month, February's nonfiction book review in my Discord. Yeah, follow me there, follow me wherever. And see you guys next time.